What is happening, spooky people? We are outside of the Peoples Mortuary Museum. We are going to take a deep dive into the business of death and, what it takes to bring somebody from their passing to the funeral to the embalming to the grave. And, it's a fascinating journey, and I'm excited to take you guys along with me. So stay tuned, and we are headed into the museum right now.
Most families, probably 98%, didn't even have cameras back in that day. They didn't have iPhones yet, so the only time that they would really pose for pictures a lot of times was either for a funeral or a wedding, and the families would be together. One of the couple interesting things about this hearse is there's no brakes on it, and so it was strictly the horses that provided the starting and stopping power, for the hearse. And if you have two guys up on the seat driving and a full casket, in the back end, it probably gave the horses quite a workout. Especially, you think about Cincinnati, the roads over there are either going up or they're going down.
Right.
And so it probably gave the team, quite a bit of work to do that. Yeah. Underneath here is what's called a transport basket, and this is what a funeral director would use to move bodies. And so, and keep in mind, we're still kind of in the mid-1800s, in that time frame. But if Granddad passed away during the night, upstairs in the bedroom, they'd get a hold of the funeral director. This is one of the items that he would take to the family home, because they would take it upstairs, put the body in, and then move him downstairs. And then this has the ends of a work bed. And the other suitcase has the center of the bed that kind of folds in half. Okay. And so he would take this and set up his work bed in the front parlor of the family home. And then they either put a sheet over, the bed, but that's where he would work. This is from the 1850s, so it's 170 years old. But this thing all comes apart, and down here in the bottom, it's lined with galvanized steel, but you'd put ice in the bottom, and then in here you can see that there's a panel, and just what you said, it has holes in it.
Okay, right.
So that the cold and so the panel would go in on that first layer of ice, the body would go in, and then there was a top section that went on, and then they filled the top section with ice also, and then there was actually a viewing portal in this room so that they could
check that out.
And the one thing that this was used for was if somebody died of a contagious disease, and even after you had died, you were still contagious. Smallpox, I imagine, but those type of things, they needed to protect the rest of the family from here. So by cooling the body down, it lessened the chance of like little droplets escaping, from the body. And this is what's called a combination car. It's an ambulance / hearse. And one of the reasons that they made combination cars was if you had a hearse like this in 1927 or the late 20s, most funeral directors, if they had 4 or 5 funerals in a month's time, that was brisk business for them. They couldn't afford to buy a car like this and only use it 4 times a month. Sure. And so quite often the person that ran the ambulance service would have at least one combination car to provide service to the funeral directors. You can see in there's a jump seat, and then there's a bracket on this side where the stretcher would have went. This flower rack is removable. So then if it's going to be a hearse, they can put the flower rack back in, remove that jump seat and stuff, and and then the casket bed is laying there on the floor. Bill bought this off of a funeral director from West Virginia, but it was restored up in Amish country. And Bill told me that they had close to 1,000 man-hours in doing the restoration on this hearse.
Wow.
And all of this gold trim was done by hand. They, masked it off and did all of that. So I can imagine it's just intricate, and, but this one has brakes on it. So,
There you go. So it helps the horses out a little bit.
yeah, and, but he took this to a car show up at Mohican State Park last year in June. I think there was a professional car society show up there, and he won best of show with this 1934 Studebaker hearse, and it's in Studebaker's presidential series, which was their top of the line. And in 34 they only made 6 hearses in the presidential series. This is the only one known to exist. Another example of a mourning dress. Most of this clothing is pretty small. People were a lot smaller than what they are today. This is a lady's casket, and it's probably a little more newer. And by newer, I mean it was probably from the 50s or 60s, but it's from one of the Orthodox. It's either the Eastern European Orthodox or the Greek Orthodox religion. And Bill got this from a funeral director south of Steubenville. So that's another one of the suitcases that the funeral director would take, to the family home. And, he would get this set up in the front parlor. In this case, we've got a transport basket, which they would have done a viewing in one of those baskets if they were just going to bury the person in a burial sheet or something like that. They might have a wooden coffin. One of the things that I found out is, let's say if you had a casket, caskets are fairly wide by the time you get to handles. In a lot of cases, caskets didn't fit in through the front door, and the doors were fairly narrow. And in some cases, they would leave the casket on the front porch, display the body for viewing inside, and then carry the body out and then transfer the body over to the casket. These are just viewing baskets for infants, and then it would have been used over and over again. They would probably just change out the liner if they needed to, or do something in that way. Okay, this section here, we're going to transition from going to the family home to the funeral parlor, and that's where the funeral director moved his family upstairs, and then the first floor became the funeral parlor. Maybe the 2 front rooms were the visitation rooms. A room in the back was his prep room, and that saved him having to haul all of that different paraphernalia to a family home to get set up and stuff. So it probably made it a lot easier on the funeral director, for handling the things, because it was all right there, and he could just, and then the people could come to him. But so the backdrop would be typical. The day bed, they would just lay the body out, again, fully dressed, and unless they used a casket or something like that. But then the family would gather around. There's another example of a burial garment. The burial garments were typically light colored, pink or white. Mourning attire was black. So, but lighting is very important in the funeral industry. These style of lights, I always call them funeral lamps, but there's a French name. I think it's torche. It's a derivative of torch, but with that open top like that. And Bill, the globes on these they're white, but Bill buys a special bulb. They're called rednecks, And what it is the bottom half of that bulb is painted red, and it pushes a much softer light downward, and then the white light goes upward and bounces off the ceiling, you know, to illuminate. Embalming became a more common practice was after the Civil War. For up until about 1930, embalming fluid was an arsenic-based material, and then they switched over to formaldehyde. But one of the things, a lot of the cemeteries, especially on the East Coast, that have a lot of late 1800s and early 1900s graves, as like those coffins and stuff have broken down and the bodies have disintegrated, there's high concentrations of arsenic in these cemeteries.
Wow.
And if you happen to have a house next to one of these old cemeteries, if you have a water well, chances are pretty good you probably have high concentrations of arsenic in your groundwaters. One of the things that I've learned too is that in the embalming process, especially for older people, if they had poor circulation, you have to insert in more than one spot in order to get the body fully embalmed. Okay, this is a 1940 Henny Packard. Henny became a coach make, kind of like Fisher Body for General Motors.
Sure.
Henny did professional car bodies, and so Packard made the chassis, the frame, the engine, the transmission, all of that, and then they sent it over to Henny. Henny would put the professional car body on, send it back to Packard, and Packard would deliver the product to the customer. If it's a funeral or a hearse, they take the seat out and, you know, that kind of stuff. So if you were a funeral director in 1940 and had a hearse like this, you had to have a warehouse or a barn or something, a huge garage to keep this thing stored in, because you sure didn't want to leave it set out, you know, in the weather. We kind of had this set up to represent like that front parlor. And you probably don't notice unless you look at the ends, but it's got netting on the casket. So a lot of times, you know, people wouldn't even really see that if they weren't paying close attention. Like the Icebox Coffin that we talked about down there, you see it's got the holes in it. And then this would have been wicker over this, but these brackets on there, they would put straps on there, and that way they could lower the body down into the Icebox Coffin, and then they would keep those straps fastened, and then they could just lift. It was easy to lift the body up.
Okay, yeah.
People like to have shoes on when they were buried. I think they were worried their feet were going to get cold, maybe, who knows. But and then this item here is called a weeping pillow, and that was something that was provided to the widow, and as she stood by the casket, she held that pillow, and it was used to catch her tears, because they didn't want the tears falling on the cosmetic of the person that was in the casket.
All right, and that'll do it for another episode of Oddity Acres. Thank you guys so much for joining us. That was such a cool little journey through the museum. Really got to learn a lot of cool things, which is really incredible. So again, thank you guys so much for hanging out with us. We will see you next time on Oddity Acres. Peace.